I am joined with Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst, good friend of this show. Mark, how you doing today, man? You doing all right?
Jamarl, I'm alive. Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
I am alive also, Mark. Breathing, living, all that good stuff. I'm glad you could join me, man. Thank you for this. So I guess we have to get to elephant in the room. Putin meets with Wickoff 4.5 hours. And from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Putin takes a hard line on the special military operation. By the same token, he's open to negotiate on other items beyond Ukraine. Now, they haven't necessarily given a readout to what was taking place, but it was said in other circles that this effectively was the tenor of the meeting. These regions are ours: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, Donetsk. We're not negotiating on those. Those are part of the Russian constitution at this point. They will remain so. However, maybe we could talk about energy deals. Maybe we could talk about, other initiatives that are taking place that we could work with you on. But this is a no-starter. Give me your take on this. What went on? Did Putin take a hard line in regards to the special military operation in those four regions? What do you know so far?
Yeah. Okay. So, with regards to there was a long discussion. It did take place. Wickoff, flew. He actually met Putin in St. Petersburg, where Putin was. Evidently, they met in presidential library up there, and Wickoff was apparently jetting right off then to Oman for the U.S.-Iran negotiations, because Wickoff is evidently the only person in the world that Trump trusts with diplomacy. Which
that is fascinating. By the way, that is fascinating to me.
Yeah. I mean, it is what it is, right? First of all, Wickoff is a real estate developer, right? I mean, he is a creature of this cutthroat business, much like Donald Trump is, right? I mean, obviously, Trump places a great deal of personal loyalty. The man has no formal diplomatic or international relations education or experience whatsoever, which certainly, he was on display in the last weeks when he was asked a question about Ukraine, and he couldn't come up with the name of the four republics, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, that Russia is claiming. You would think, being central to those negotiations, that maybe knowing those four names might be, but details schmetails, right? I mean, that's the way the Trump administration rolls, obviously. Privately, Russians have commented to various news outlets in Russia and beyond that, I'm going to paraphrase what they said. I mean, that it's like sitting across the table with little kids coloring and trying to instruct them not to color outside the lines, right? I mean, that's what's, in diplomatic, in terms of the formalities and necessities of high stakes geopolitical diplomatic negotiations. I'm sure that if a Putin was, looking for a hot piece of property, a condo in the Hamptons, I mean, I'm sure Wickoff would be the go-to guy. I mean, but considering that that's not the topic of discussion. On the other hand, quite obviously, Trump doesn't trust anyone in the blob, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning no one in the State Department, the foreign services, the diplomatic corps, you want to call it the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy. I like the blob. Ben Rhodes rolled with that. I think that works for me. He doesn't trust anyone, right? He's not sending Marco Rubio, or Marco Rubio is a neocon, So obviously, Trump doesn't trust him that much. He's not sending, the Russian U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's not sending anyone like this. Haven't even decided on the Russian ambassador to Europe, or U.S. ambassador to Russia. Sorry. So Wickoff doesn't have the ideological baggage that comes with someone whom is a product of advancement within the State Department, right? Or, the Foreign Services, the Diplomatic Corps, which, it is the foreign policy orthodoxy of hegemony and a certain, shall we say, animosity towards countries like Russia, China, and Iran, right? Now, Wickoff doubtless has his own opinions. He has publicly expressed, that Russia considers these regions to be their own. He's admitted that, their referendums were held and the, largely Russian-speaking people of these regions, voted to become part of Russia. I think that's, referring to it as Russian speaking is always simplifying. It's the question that in Ukraine, there are two competing conceptions of national identity, right? Mm-hmm. You can generalize Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking, but that's not the truth of it. There are, Zelensky himself was born Russian speaking, right? And there are, a number of Ukrainian people that don't agree with the regime in Kiev either. It's more about how you view what Ukraine is and what it means to be Ukrainian, right? Do you have a Banderite conception of that, or do you have a conception, as most East Ukrainians do, that Russia, that Ukraine and Russia are brother peoples separated by a modern political border? Right. That's the deal. Anyway, Wickoff, highlighted these things, and that already, earned him the ire of the Kiev regime, of European leaders, of U.S. neocons in Congress, who have declared him a Russian propagandist for simply, reciting reality. I mean, there are complexities, there are nuances, but these things are also true. To a very large degree, depending on your narrative spin of the situation. So I can't imagine, for instance, say Marco Rubio saying something, admitting something like that. So Wickoff is the go-to guy, right? And he's the go-to guy, not just for Russia, Ukraine, but also for Israel and Palestine, and now in Oman, talking to the Iranians. Which is, it's fascinating. It describes really Trump's political isolation in the United States. What a very small group of people he has around him that he really trusts and runs the country. It's definitely a minor, even with his own administration, he doesn't trust most of the people. That's fascinating. It may speak to some fragility down the line for the Trump administration. But regardless, these talks with Putin lasted, a considerable amount of time. We don't have an official readout, but Putin did, speak to the Duma afterwards, right, to committee, and we know that he's still standing by Russia's position. I mean, it's far more than just territorial. At the top of it is no NATO, no de facto NATO, no NATO troops, no NATO training, no NATO arms, no NATO nothing, no NATO, yet NATO, yet, right? Yeah, right. That has to be codified. That has to be legalized. That has to be officiated, recognized, and accepted in a way that Russia would believe the U.S. and the rest of the West when they give up that ghost on Ukraine, which I have to say, I don't know how that could be done, that I personally would trust it, because I wouldn't. Right? I mean, we've seen Trump rip up the JCPOA. We've seen the U.S. pull out of this treaty, that treaty. We've seen the Kiev regime pull, use both rounds of the Minsk Accords just to buy time to mobilize and to build up a military. We've seen them, continue with the Istanbul communique peace deal simply as another time buying mechanism, and then saying psych and pulling it out. We've seen the Black Sea Grain Initiative not upheld by the West, by the Kiev regime, by anyone. So why you would trust them at all? I don't know. I mean, you could say that at some point they have to, but I would think that point has to be with a Russian boot on the neck and troops in Kiev. That's and I don't know if I would trust them then, to be perfectly honest. So it is what it is. But there is no indication coming out of these talks, right? Either from the U.S. side or the Russia side, that Russia has moved from their, hardline positions, which they reiterated again and again, right? No ceasefire before a permanent peace settlement first, and then we cease firing afterwards, because we've been led down this garden path, before. Again, both Minsk Accords and so forth. So there's that. There's also the questions of demilitarization, debanderization, often called denazification of Ukraine. There's lots of things involved there, but there's no indication that Putin has moved one iota. The Russia's simply not prepared to make concessions to the United States. One, because the United States is not some third-party mediator, right? We've had the New York Times admit how deeply involved, right, in this conflict the United States was, in exhaustive detail, planning everything out from the strategic, operational, down to the tactical level directed on the battlefield, right? That they were behind, every single long-range strike, coordinates, satellite data, that they were, preparing they were directing the Kiev regime military as puppets, largely out of Germany, sometimes in Ukraine itself. We've had Marco Rubio admit that the conflict was a U.S. proxy war against Ukraine. I mean, against Russia in Ukraine, right? We've had all that. So the U.S. is losing this war, right? I mean, you could make it, project into the future that they've lost this war. Okay, that's a bit premature yet. Yes, there's black swan events. Things. It is possible that things could change. It is possible that Russia could win the war and lose the peace, because that's what happened in Syria. I mean, and they lost it rather badly there. So I don't want to, until everything is signed, sealed, and delivered, I don't want to say Russia has won this war, right? But they definitely are winning this war, and that means against the United States. Secondly, because Russia has such a undeniable, well, I mean, they still do. I say undeniable, but the Western media tries to present it as if it's some kind of stalemate. Oh, Russia's not making real progress, that sort of mass territorial rhetoric that is expected out of a 24/7 cable news Hollywood type of infotainment expectations. But the reality on the battlefield is another thing entirely. And Russia's not going to give anything up when it's both winning on the battlefield and the attritional war of the military-industrial complexes. In fact, it is likely that Russia has at this point set on that there's not going to be a peace settlement, that the U.S. will never accept Russian terms, and that Russia is just going to have to take more, right? Because Putin said that if you don't agree soon, then we're going to have to take Odessa, Kharkov, these other regions. And right now, Russia is advancing into the Sumy region. They're building up troops on the a little bit to the west on the border of the Chernigov region in northern Ukraine as well. And it is through Sumy and Chernigov, two different directions, that Russia advanced into Kiev in the beginning of the conflict in 22. So I just want to point that out there. Russia is also just a couple of kilometers away from the Dnipropetrovsk region. They'll be moving into that in the next few weeks, and they're moving into Zaporozhye. They're already well into Kharkov, right? And making it, that front, the Kharkov front, has become activated again within the last 2 weeks, with Russia after a very long pause and a real stalemate there, Russia has begun pushing in Volchansk in the Kharkov region again as well. So, Russia is set for major offensives, right? When Marco Rubio said a couple weeks ago that we'll know in a couple weeks whether Russia really wants peace. Well, this is what he's talking about, right? Russia is about to launch an offensives. And no, Russia does not want peace except on their terms, right? But that's what everyone wants. I mean, everyone wants peace. Everyone says that. Oh, Putin wants to stop the beautiful people from dying, right? Obviously, the people in Yemen and Iran and other places aren't beautiful. That little racist thing there, I'm just saying. Everyone wants peace, but will only accept it on their terms, and that's Russia is not ready to accept an American dictated peace from the losing side in this conflict. With Kellogg talking openly about partitioning Ukraine basically on the contact line now and setting British and French troops on the ground there. I mean, that's tossing a red flag in front of Russia, like a bullfighter or something. That's what that is, because Russia's never going to accept that. They began this conflict to keep NATO out of Ukraine, right? They're not, to a very large degree, they are not going to accept as part of the diplomatic settlement NATO troops, whatever hat they're wearing on the ground in Ukraine, right? Claiming part of Ukraine as their defensive territory. No, that's simply not going to happen. And I think people who promote that, whether we're talking Starmer, Macron, now Kellogg, I think they know that Russia will never accept that, right? They don't want a ceasefire. They don't want a peace settlement on Russia's terms or anyone else's now except their own. And they're throwing a spanner in the works just by bringing that up. They're making sure that Russia will never seriously consider any such path of negotiations moving forward, if that's a possibility down the line. Mm-hmm. I think that's where we are. So again, Russia hasn't taken a step back, right? By all accounts, coming out of meeting with Wickoff. In fact, it's very likely that they're pushing forward for more now. They're ready to go all out. And that's going to lead to a lot of really negative headlines in the Western press in the next few
They already
weeks.
are.
But I mean, that's nothing new, right? Yeah. I mean, that's nothing new. Russia, if the Western, we wanted peace, but Putin doesn't really want peace, blah blah blah. That comes out. Yeah, we don't want peace on your terms, that's for sure. Peace on our terms. We started this conflict. We're gonna finish it. You don't win, right? That's neither militarily or diplomatically. So that's it's probably going to be something that's going to be a bitter pill, and ultimately, I've said this since Trump was elected, right back in the U.S., that eventually there is going to come a point where Putin is going to say niet, Putin is going to say no, in whatever nice diplomatic, but we can talk about this and this and this terms that he does it on. But Putin will say no, and that at that moment, it's going to come down to what does Trump do, because his own administration is not in any type of agreement. There is no plan, right? No consensus on moving forward, right? There's obviously a vast gulf between what Wickoff is saying, right? Whether he agrees with it, he's recited these elements, but certainly what the Kellogg's and the Waltzes and these other people are saying. So Trump is, he's realizing how little cards, he actually has in his hand, how much the Russians have, and the American cards are probably made in China anyway. Let's recognize that fact. Where does that leave him, right? He's going to have to make a decision. He's already just over the weekend, since Friday, extended the Biden era sanctions against Russia for another year, right? He signed those that he needed to extend, right? He has extended them. And he's at various times made threats and the like, about increased sanctions. But does anyone seriously believe that U.S. putting secondary sanctions and inflicting punishment on other countries in the world to try to force them to stop trading with Russia, because that's all that's left, right? I mean, there's nothing left, to threaten Russia with, on a bilateral basis. It's only
China's not going to accept it.
Yeah,
India's
it's
not going to
going
accept
after
it.
the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think that to a large extent, the reaction of China and others to the tariffs war tells us, what kind of mentality China and a lot of the other countries are in. They're not going to bow to the Trump administration. Some would, right? But the important ones to this conflict would not. So where does that leave him? Right now, Kellogg and Waltz and peace through strength. You need to escalate to de-escalate, right? If you want peace, you've got to be strong. That's what they're telling him. And Wickoff is like, just, you don't care about Ukraine. Just ditch it. Get rid of it. It's something the Biden administration left us with, right?
And by the way, Trump is saying that. Trump has said this is Joe Biden's war. This is not my war. I didn't start this war. I just got here. I'm trying to end it.
It's like going to take an enormous political strength of will and an enormous expenditure of political capital for him to just walk away, right? That's the smart move. I mean, Steve Bannon recommended that already months ago.
Away. That's right.
Yep. Right. But can Trump do it? We don't know. Right? We don't know.
This is going to be a lot of
find out.
headlines.
But Russia is not blinking. Russia is not blinking. In fact, they are the only ones right now with focus and determination, right? They're like, yes, talk, diplomacy, talk's good, but we're moving forward on the battlefield in a big way, right? And we're not pausing. We're not hesitating, right? We'll give talks a chance, but that chance does not involve us interrupting in escalation on the battlefield, which is what we're about to do now.
Do you think the escalation, oftentimes as peace deals are being signed out, the forces escalate just before the deal? They want to get everything that they can. It's like we're grabbing up as much as we possibly can just before the deal is signed.
There is no deal about to be signed, though.
No, I agree with that.
There isn't. They're not even close.
No, agree. But do you think that part of it is, okay, we'll have these talks with the U.S. We're perfectly fine with talking, but we are going to get whatever we can and as much as we can, as fast as we can, before we even get into, let's say, the meat of a real conversation, before we even get to the point of a potential ceasefire, if indeed the U.S. is willing to abide by our terms of stopping intelligence, stopping weapons, et cetera, et cetera. Is it that, or is it these talks don't matter? We're pursuing our course on the battlefield in the way we pursue our course on the battlefield. They're irrelevant.
I would say that the Kremlin is probably split themselves on both sides of that issue, right? I would say that there are people within the Kremlin that are just like, go, take it all, talk later, you guys can talk over there, right? If Putin went, but ultimately things are really going to be decided on the battlefield. And we can either negotiate that these 4 regions are ours, or we can finish making that a reality and then moving on to the next thing, right? And I think that's where they are. There are others that hope that that the Trump administration might see reason, right? That will argue that lives can be saved, right, if they can be forced to accept the realities on the battlefield diplomatically, right? But there is no indication that they have, not even within the Trump administration, who have come, it must be said, much further than the Biden administration in admitting those realities. But it hasn't significantly, made them give up Ukraine for good, right? They still regard the Kiev regime as their proxy, that they need to preserve as much as they can of it in negotiations rather than walk away from it. Never mind that it's clear Zelensky has nothing but contempt for, or Trump has nothing but contempt for Zelensky and for everyone else in his administration, that he doesn't much personally care about Ukraine, right? But this was the stone that was put around his neck when he won the presidency, right? He's the president. This is his war now, right? So how he chooses to move forward, it's complicated, right? There's lots of things to take in, and I, things that he said on the campaign, oh, I'll end this war in 24 hours, and then it was, oh, I'll end it in 100 days, and then, oh, on April 20th, right? Ultimately, unless he gives in to Russia's demands, then he doesn't decide when this conflict does, right? The Kremlin does.